In all previous SQL queries that we've created, we selected all fields from a record stored in a database. But sometimes you don't need to return all the fields. Sometimes you need to return one or two specific. So what if we wanted to return first name and last name only instead of all fields that user entity has? Let's look at the user entity object, for example. I will open its implementation, and the user entity has so many fields. And in some cases, we might have even more fields. So in this video, we will learn how to return only first name and last name and not return the rest of the fields. So I'll go back to my user repository and I'll create a new SQL query that returns only first name and last name. So I'll paste it here. I will rename my method from find users by keyword to find user first name and last name by keyword. And now I will edit SQL query. Instead of selecting all fields from a record, I will select user first name and I will select user last name only from users where user first name like and user last name like. Okay, so now because we're selecting only a couple of fields, we are not going to return entire user entity object. We are going to return a list of array of objects, and this array of objects will hold values of first name and last name only. If we are selecting only two fields from our database record, then this array of objects will contain only two items. Okay, so now I will save this and I'll go to my user repository test and I will write a new test method to test this SQL query. I'll go to user repository test and I will copy one of my existing test methods. We'll paste it here. Now I will go back to user repository, copy the method, and I will use it here. I'll just give it a prefix test, find user by first name and last name and by keyword. Now I will leave the keyword the same. I will now call a different method on user repository, find user first name and last name by keyword, like this. And now it accepts a list of entity, but I will need to accept a list of objects instead. Okay, and for the keyword I will use the same keyword. I will expect this method to return two records, and when I get the first record, now I don't get back user entity, but I get back an array of objects like this. So I can delete this assertion and try to extract user first name and last name from this user object now. So I will say string user first name user array, and I will access first name at index 0 because this is array. And how do I know that first name is stored at index 0 inside of a user array? This is because of my SQL query. If I go back to my user repository, I first select user first name and then select user last name. So user first name will be at index 0 inside of this array of objects, and the value of user last name will be at index 1. So I'll go back to my user repository test, and because this is object and I'm storing it in a string variable, I will need to get a value of string out of it. So I'll use string object and I'll get value of, and I will give it a value that I read from user at index 0. And now I'll do the same but for the user last name. Okay, so user last name equals, but the last name will be stored at index 1. And now I can assert that these two values are not null. So for example, assert not null first name and assert not null last name. And let me actually print out the values so that we can see them. System out println first name equals user first name and user last name equals user last name, like this. Okay, so our test method is ready. Let's try running it and see if it works. I'll actually put a breakpoint so that I can inspect values. So I'll put a breakpoint here and I'll put a breakpoint here. And now I will debug this test class, debug as JUnitTest. Switch to debug perspective, I'll say no. And here we go, we are inside of create records. Let me remove this breakpoint and resume debugging. No. And now we are inside of find user first name and last name method. Let me move mouse over the user first name and I see the value. The value is here, so it's successful. User last name is also here, so this assertion should pass and I should get these two values printed. So resume debugging. No, let's look at the console. And we have first name equals Sergey, so it's printing well, and I should print the last name as well. And last name is printed here as well. So it's working. We got back 2 records, and each record contains an array of objects. We can also validate that there are only 2 fields inside of our user record, and I can use assertions. Assert true, for example, and inside of my assert true I will check for the length, and this should be equal to 2. Let me resume debugging to finish my previous run, and now I will simply run this unit test and expect all methods to pass. So I will run it as JUnitTest, and this assertion should be true. And here we go, all test methods pass, and I know this assertion is true, which tells me that my user object contains only 2 items. One item is first name and the other item is last name. Okay, so let's continue.